There's something that's been hidden from you for millennia, something so damn powerful that whoever holds that knowledge has pulled every string to keep you from ever getting close to it. And the most disturbing part isn't just that this secret exists. It's that it's been locked away right inside the texts you grew up hearing, within the very words of Jesus, in passages sitting there wide open, available for anyone to read today, and yet almost nobody sees what's really written, because you were taught to read those words in one specific way, a way that guarantees you never grasp what they truly mean. Ever wonder why, even when you're doing everything right, praying, trying to live a good life, you still feel this invisible force dragging you down? This sense that no matter how much you push forward, something always yanks you back to the same spot. A cycle that repeats, a prison you can't quite describe but feel in your bones every single day. That's not weakness on your part, that's not a lack of faith. And it sure as hell isn't coincidence. The Gnostics, those first followers of Christ who were persecuted, whose texts were burned and buried for centuries, they had a name for this force. They called them Archons, control entities, architects of a reality designed specifically to keep human consciousness trapped, sleeping, spinning in false cycles of suffering, fear, and illusion. And they laid it out with a clarity that sends shivers down your spine, that Jesus knew exactly who these Archons were, and he came with a specific teaching to break their grip. I'm not talking theory here. I'm not talking vague spiritual speculation. I'm talking about texts unearthed in Egypt in 1945, hidden in clay jars in the caves of Nag Hammadi, texts the Catholic Church absolutely did not want you to read. Documents that unveil a conversation between Jesus and his closest disciples that will flip everything you think you know about Christ's mission completely on its head. This isn't another pretty spiritual reflection. This isn't self-help wrapped in religious veneer. What you're about to see here in the next few minutes are the two exact steps Jesus described to break archontic control in this life, in this body, right now. Two moves anyone can make that don't demand complex rituals, don't require years of study, that you can put into practice as early as tonight. But there's one thing you need to know before we go further. These two steps only work if you fully grasp what Archons are, how they operate, and why most people spend their entire lives inside this prison without even realizing the bars exist. And that's exactly what I'm going to show you, layer by layer, from the beginning to the end of this video. Stick with me. What comes next will change how you see everything. Your life, your spirituality, your suffering, and most importantly, your freedom. Look, I gotta tell you something before we dive deep into this. I spent a long time feeling exactly what you're probably feeling right now. This sense that there's more going on than meets the eye. That the answers we were given our whole lives, in school, in church, on TV, are just pieces of a puzzle that never quite fit together. And it was only when I stopped accepting the pre-packaged explanations and started digging into the original texts, the manuscripts that survived centuries of persecution and censorship, that the picture began to make sense in a way no Sunday sermon ever could. In this video, you'll understand who the Archons are and why Jesus mentioned them. You'll uncover the two steps he laid out to break that control, and you'll walk away with a real, practical tool you can use today. If you've ever felt like there's something nobody's telling you, that there's a layer of reality always just out of reach, go ahead and hit that like button now. It helps this content reach folks who need it. Subscribe to the channel too, because what's coming in the next videos is directly connected to what we're revealing today, and you won't want to miss it. And drop a comment below, just the word Archon, if you want to know more about this topic. I want to see how many people are awake to this conversation. Now, let's get to the real meat of it. To understand what Jesus was teaching about archontic control, you first need to pull back a few centuries and grasp the context in which these teachings emerged. Not the context they taught you in Sunday school. The real, historical, philosophical, and spiritual context that existed in the Mediterranean world of the 1st century CE. The Middle East and the Greco-Roman world back then were a simmering cauldron of spiritual ideas. Second Temple Judaism was fragmented into dozens of currents, the Essenes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, each with a different vision of God, the law, and liberation. At the same time, Hellenism had spread throughout the region, a set of philosophies that posed deep questions about the nature of the cosmos, the soul, good and evil. It was within this cauldron that Gnosticism arose, not as a separate religion at first, but as a specific way of interpreting spiritual experience. The word gnosis comes from Greek and means knowledge, but not the kind of knowledge you learn from books. It means direct, experiential, inner knowledge. A knowing that transforms the receiver because it's lived, not just intellectually comprehended. The Gnostics had a cosmology, a vision of the universe, radically different from everything Orthodox Judaism and later Christianity would teach. For them, the material world wasn't the creation of the supreme God, the father of Jesus, what they called the pleroma, the fullness of being. The material world was an imperfect copy, a prison built by intermediary entities called Archons, a Greek word that literally means rulers or sovereigns. Who was the creator of these Archons, according to Gnostic texts? An entity called the demiurge, which in Greek means artisan or craftsman. The demiurge, these texts say, was a force that created the material universe from a captured spark of divine light, but without full access to divine knowledge. And the Archons were his agents, 7 or 12, depending on the Gnostic system you study, each governing a sphere or dimension of material existence, working to keep human souls trapped in the cycle of birth, life, suffering, and death. What makes this so relevant to what Jesus taught is that the texts found in Nag Hammadi, especially the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, the Apocryphon of John, and the hypostasis of the Archons, present Jesus not as a simple moral preacher, but as an emissary from the pleroma, someone sent specifically to bring the knowledge that allows souls to escape the archontic prison. In the Apocryphon of John, one of the most complete texts in this collection, Jesus appears to John after the resurrection and reveals a complete system of creation, explaining step by step how the Archons function, how they keep souls imprisoned, and what's necessary to break that control. This text is extraordinarily detailed. It's not vague. It's not metaphoric in the sense of being indecipherable. It describes specific mechanisms. And here's one of the pieces of information that impressed me most when I first studied this material. The Archons, according to the Apocryphon of John, don't control souls through physical chains or incomprehensible esoteric magic. They control through two very precise mechanisms that anyone who opens their eyes can immediately recognize in the way our world operates today. The first mechanism is Gnostic forgetfulness. The Archons implant in humans what the text calls the veil of forgetfulness, a barrier that prevents the soul from remembering its divine origin, its connection to the pleroma, its true nature. Without this memory, the soul gets lost in matter, searching in objects, relationships, status, physical pleasure, and fear for what can only be found in recognizing its own essence. The second mechanism is imitation. The Archons, these texts claim, don't create anything new. They imitate, copy, distort. They take the structures of the pleroma and reproduce them in a degraded form in the material world. An archontic family imitates the divine family. A power hierarchy imitates a spiritual hierarchy. An institutionalized religion imitates true gnosis. And through these imitations, they keep souls occupied with copies, never reaching the original. Does that sound disturbingly familiar? It should. Because if you look at the modern world with these two concepts in mind, forgetfulness and imitation, suddenly a whole lot of things that seemed random start to make unsettling sense. But before we get to the present, I need to show you how Jesus directly addressed these two mechanisms in his teachings, because that's where the two steps reveal themselves with crystalline clarity. What makes all of this even more shocking is understanding why these texts were buried, why they only survived in clay jars in the Egyptian desert, and what was destroyed so you'd never get close to this information. In December of 1945, an Egyptian peasant named Muhammad Ali al-Salman was digging near Nag Hammadi, in Upper Egypt, when he found a sealed red clay jar. Inside were 12 papyrus codices bound in leather, containing 52 texts in Coptic, the language of Christian Egyptians. These were manuscripts dated to the 4th century, but which, based on linguistic analysis and citations in other documents, represented translations of Greek originals from the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. What these texts revealed was a form of Christianity completely different from what would become official, a form of faith centered not on obedience to an institution and belief in dogmas, but on the direct experience of inner divine light, what Jesus called in the Gospel of Thomas, also found at Nag Hammadi, the kingdom that is inside you and all around you. But there's something even deeper to consider. The archontic system described in these texts presents an almost exact correspondence with what modern quantum physics might call the illusion of consensual reality. Physicist David Bohm, one of the greatest theoreticians of 20th century quantum mechanics, developed the concept of the implicate order, the idea that the material universe we perceive is a holographic projection of a deeper, non-local reality. Philosopher and neuroscientist Thomas Metzinger, in his work on the ego as a constructive illusion, reached conclusions that the Gnostics articulated 2,000 years earlier using the language of their time. The Archons, in modern parlance, could be understood as the programmatic patterns that structure ordinary perception of reality, the filters that transform the limitless field of pure consciousness into a world of separation, scarcity, fear, and death. And what Jesus proposed, as recorded in the Gnostic texts, wasn't a religious solution in the conventional sense. It was a technology of consciousness, 2 specific steps to deactivate these filters and perceive reality as it truly is. And these 2 steps are hidden in plain sight, in texts you can read right now. But you need to know where to look, and more importantly, what to look for when you look. Now you have the historical and philosophical foundation to understand what comes next. But here's where it gets really uncomfortable, where the information stops being merely fascinating and starts to get personally disturbing. You've probably heard that the Bible we have today went through a selection process, that some books were included and others were excluded at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, convened by the Roman Emperor Constantine. What most people don't know is the specific criteria used to determine what got in and what stayed out. The criterion wasn't simply antiquity. It wasn't just historical authenticity. The primary criterion, documented in the correspondence of bishops of the time, was apostolicity combined with alignment with the doctrine that was being established. In practice, this meant that texts presenting a vision of Jesus as a revealer of inner knowledge, as a guide to a direct experience with the divine that needed no institutional mediation, were systematically eliminated. Theologian Bart Ehrman, a professor at the University of North Carolina and one of the world's leading experts on early biblical texts, has extensively documented this process in works like Lost Christianities and Forged. According to Ehrman, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, there wasn't a single form of Christianity, but dozens of competing forms, each claiming apostolic authenticity, each with its own sacred texts. What survived was what served the power structure that was being built. What was destroyed or buried was what taught that every person has direct access to the divine, without the need for a priest, without the need for an institution, without the need for an intermediary. This is the teaching that the Archons, according to the Gnostic texts themselves, fear most. Because a human being who knows they carry the divine spark within, who knows how to access it, is a human being who cannot be completely controlled. And here's the moment I need you to pause for a second and think about this with me. Not abstractly. Think about your own life. How many times have you sought validation outside yourself? How many times have you felt you needed approval from someone, an institution, a system, to feel worthy, safe, sufficient? How many times has fear paralyzed you, not a fear of something concrete and present, but that diffuse, objectless fear that seems to come from within but has no name? The Gnostic texts would say that these states, the search for external validation, the feeling of inadequacy, the objectless fear, are exactly what archontic control produces. They are the fruits of forgetfulness and imitation operating at full force within the human psyche. And now comes the question I need to ask you directly. Have you ever felt, at any point in your life, that you were stuck in a cycle that made no sense? That no matter how hard you tried, something always pulled you back to the same pattern? If you're feeling that now, or if you ever have, type the word Owakin in the comments below. Just that. Owakin. I want to see how many people are awake to this conversation, because the number of people who comment that word will tell me exactly how much this content needs to keep being made. And listen, what we've just covered is only the beginning, because in the next few minutes I'm going to get into the heart of what Jesus specifically said about how to break that control. I'm going to show you the exact passages, the 2 steps described with a precision that will leave you speechless, and I'll explain why these steps work not just on a spiritual plane, but in a way that modern neuroscience is beginning to confirm. Stay right here. Let's talk about proof now. Because I know there's a part of you that might be hearing all this and thinking, this is fascinating, but where's the concrete evidence? And that's exactly the right question to ask. Knowledge that presents itself as transformative needs to be able to stand up to scrutiny, historical, philosophical, and even scientific. And what I'm about to show you is that the evidence for what we're discussing isn't scarce. It's abundant. The problem is, it's scattered across different disciplines, in different languages, in different traditions, and nobody usually connects all these dots in a single conversation. Let's start with the textual evidence. The Nag Hammadi manuscripts, discovered in 1945, have undergone decades of rigorous academic analysis. The Institute for Antiquity and Christianity at Claremont Graduate University in Southern California has dedicated decades to studying these texts. James Robinson, who edited the complete critical edition of the Nag Hammadi library in English, documented the antiquity of these texts based on radiocarbon dating, paleographic analysis of the Coptic handwriting, and comparison with citations in the texts of the so-called Church Fathers, like Irenaeus of Lyon and Tertullian, who wrote extensively against Gnosticism as early as the 2nd century, which proves these teachings were widely circulating at that time. The fact that Irenaeus, around 180 CE, wrote a 5-volume treatise titled Against Heresies, specifically to combat Gnostic ideas, is in itself powerful evidence. You don't write 5 volumes against something nobody's taking seriously. Gnosticism was a spiritual current with deep penetration in the Mediterranean world, and the texts he fought against were exactly those describing the Archons and the path of liberation Jesus supposedly taught. But there's a second category of evidence that many people overlook: comparative philosophical evidence. The concept of intermediary forces that govern the material world and imprison souls appears in completely independent traditions. In Plato's philosophy, especially in Timaeus, the demiurge creates the material world as an imperfect copy of the world of eternal forms. In the Hermetic texts of Hellenistic Egypt, compiled in the Corpus Hermeticum, there's a description almost identical to the Gnostic one of planetary spheres governed by archons that human beings must traverse to return to the source. In the Jewish Merkabah tradition, the mysticism of the divine throne, there are texts that describe hostile guardians called Iron and Kedushin who try to prevent the soul's ascent. The convergence of these independent traditions on such a specific set of ideas, the material world as a prison, intermediary forces as jailers, inner knowledge as the key to liberation, is no coincidence. It's the kind of convergence that historians of religion call a structural parallel, and it suggests that different cultures, at different times, were describing the same experience from different perspectives. There's even a third category of evidence that might be the most disconcerting: neuroscientific evidence. Neuroscientist Michael Graziano, from Princeton University, developed the attention schema theory, which proposes that the consciousness we experience as I, as self, as the inner observer, is a construction of the nervous system, a model the brain generates to monitor and control its own attention. In other words, the you that you feel yourself to be is a representation, not the underlying reality. This echoes with disturbing precision what the Gnostic texts describe as the ego constructed by the Archons. The identity you believe yourself to be, limited, mortal, separate, defined by your personal history and by what others think of you, is, according to these texts, exactly the kind of construction the Archons project to keep the divine spark imprisoned, and modern neuroscience, taking a completely different route, is reaching the same conclusion. The self is a construct. It's not the ultimate reality. Psychologist Stanislav Grof, who spent decades researching non-ordinary states of consciousness, documented across thousands of therapeutic sessions the phenomenon he termed transpersonal experiences, states in which consciousness seemed to expand beyond the ego's boundaries, accessing what subjects consistently described as a more fundamental reality, an all-encompassing light, a presence both personal and universal. Grof observed that these states frequently led to lasting and profound transformations in the subjects' lives, a reduction in the fear of death, the dissolution of compulsive behavioral patterns, and an increase in empathy and a sense of purpose. In Gnostic terms, what these subjects were experiencing was precisely what the texts describe as the awakening of the divine spark, the moment the veil of forgetfulness lifts and the soul recognizes its true nature. What's especially relevant here is that none of these states relied on external rituals belonging to an institution or the acceptance of dogma. They depended exclusively on an inner process, a shift in perspective that occurs when consciousness ceases to fully identify with the ego construct. This is exactly what Jesus described, and that's why this teaching had to be eliminated, because it rendered any intermediary completely unnecessary. Now we need to get into the most uncomfortable part of this whole conversation, the part that usually generates the most resistance, not because it's impossible to verify, but because the implications are simply too vast to be easily assimilated. We need to talk about what was deliberately done to ensure you never got close to this information, and I'm not talking about vague conspiracy theories. I'm talking about documented historical events, recorded institutional decisions, and patterns of behavior that have consistently repeated themselves over centuries. The story of what was hidden begins long before the Council of Nicaea. As early as the late 2nd century, Irenaeus of Lyon had established the principle that only texts approved by the episcopal hierarchy held spiritual authority. That sounds reasonable at first glance, until you realize what he was doing by establishing this principle. He was transferring authority from individual inner experience, from direct contact with the divine, to an institutional structure that he controlled. Historian Elaine Pagels, a professor of religion at Princeton and author of The Gnostic Gospels, a book that won the National Book Award, meticulously documents how this transfer of authority was the central move in the formation of what would become Orthodox Christianity. Pagels shows that the issue wasn't primarily about what Jesus had actually said or done, but about who had the right to interpret and transmit the teaching. And the Orthodox answer was clear. Only the episcopal hierarchy, in an unbroken line of apostolic succession, held that right. What this answer effectively eliminated was any possibility of direct access, of personal gnosis, of liberation that didn't pass through the institutional filter. In Gnostic terms, it replaced the path of liberation from the Archons with a structure that precisely reproduced archontic functioning, a hierarchy of power that mediated access to the divine, defined what was sacred and what was heresy, and controlled through fear and dependency. But the erasure didn't stop with the texts. In 385 CE, Emperor Theodosius I made Nicene Christianity the sole legal religion of the Roman Empire, criminalizing all alternative forms. Gnostic libraries in Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome were destroyed. Practitioners were persecuted. Some were executed. What survived was what managed to be hidden, like the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, buried in clay jars by monks who likely knew they would be the last to read them for a very long time. And here's something that's rarely mentioned in this context. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria, one of the ancient world's greatest repositories of knowledge, wasn't a single event. It was a process of multiple destructions over centuries, and historians like Luciano Canfora document that at least one of the most destructive phases occurred under the orders of Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria in 391 CE, amidst the campaign to eradicate religions and philosophies alternative to Nicene Christianity. This isn't anti-Christianity. It's history. And understanding this history is necessary to grasp why the two steps Jesus described to break archontic control reached us fragmented, distorted, hidden in texts most people have never read. Because what was most carefully censored wasn't the abstract theological aspects of Gnosticism. It was the practical, operational dimension, the specific procedures. What to do, how to do it, when to do it. The detailed map for inner liberation that renders any external authority completely superfluous. That was the primary target, and it survived, as we'll see now, in pieces that need to be carefully reassembled. What was hidden, what's in the text that no one taught you to see, will now finally make sense. But to get there, we first need to understand which spiritual tradition this knowledge fits into, because it doesn't just belong to Christian Gnosticism. It resonates with something much broader, older, and more universal than any specific tradition. Virtually every great spiritual tradition of humanity, when you go deep enough, when you move past the external forms and reach the core, carries a central affirmation that's always the same. The human being is fundamentally more than they appear to be. There's a dimension of human consciousness that transcends the ego, transcends personal history, transcends the physical body, and when accessed, it changes everything. In Hinduism, especially in the Advaita Vedanta traditions, this core is called Atman, the true self, which is identical to Brahman, the universal consciousness. The sage Adi Shankaracharya, in the 8th century, systematized this understanding with mathematical elegance. The world we perceive as separate and multiple is Maya, an illusion built upon the singular, undivided reality of consciousness. What the Gnostics called the archontic illusion, Shankaracharya called Maya. The conceptual structure is different, but the core insight is the same. In Buddhism, especially in the Vajrayana traditions of Tibet, there's a concept called Rigpa, which is pure, unconditioned awareness, present beneath all mental states, and representing the true nature of every being. Tibetan Buddhism developed extremely sophisticated practices to access Rigpa, and the Tlopsen for Armaditanabi and Pardo the Dradalodik describes in detail the entity's consciousness encounters after death, entities that present themselves in terrifying or seductive forms to keep the soul trapped in the cycle of reincarnations. These entities, called wrathful deities in Tibetan texts, have a clear structural correspondence with the Gnostic Archons. In Sufism, the Islamic mystical tradition, the concept of Nafs al-Amara, the commanding self, precisely describes the archontic function. It's the dimension of the ego that directs one toward what is harmful, constantly seeks external satisfaction, and is fundamentally self-oriented in a way that excludes the experience of the divine. The goal of the Sufi path is the transmutation of this ego into Nafs al-Mutmainah, the tranquil self, which no longer seeks externally because it has found what it sought within. Jesus, in the Gospel of Thomas, says something that becomes much clearer in light of these traditions. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. This statement, in the Gnostic context, isn't a vague metaphor about emotional authenticity. It's a technical instruction. What's within you is the divine spark, the pleroma in miniature, and the act of bringing it forth, of recognizing it, of consciously dwelling from it, is precisely the first of the two steps to break archontic control. And here's where Western philosophy enters in a surprising way. René Descartes, in the 17th century, with his famous assertion cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, did something that at first glance seems very different from what we're discussing. But when you go deeper, you realize Descartes was seeking the exact same thing as the Gnostics, a point of absolute certainty that couldn't be destroyed by any doubt. And the point he found was consciousness itself, the pure fact of experiencing, which is irreducible even when you doubt everything else. Contemporary philosopher David Chalmers, in his work on what he calls the hard problem of consciousness, articulates this precisely. Subjective experience, what it's like to be something from the inside, cannot be explained solely in terms of physical processes. There's a residue, a dimension of experience that completely eludes any materialistic explanation. Chalmers calls this the hard problem because science still lacks adequate tools to address it. Gnostics wouldn't call this a problem. They'd call it evidence. Evidence that consciousness isn't a product of the material world, but the reality that precedes and sustains it. Evidence that the divine spark is real. And evidence that the mechanisms that make us forget this are equally real, because otherwise, so much effort wouldn't have been necessary, over so many centuries, to ensure you never had this conversation. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, now's the time to hit that button below and ring the bell. Because what's coming in the next videos dives deeper into all of this in a way you won't want to miss. And look, I need to ask you a direct question right now, a question I want you to answer honestly in the comments. Have you ever, at any point in your life, felt that presence within you that's more real than everything around you? That silence beneath all thoughts, that feeling that there's something in you that's never been touched by any suffering? Comment below, yes or no. That's it. Yes or no. Because your answer will tell me how close you already are to what we're about to reveal. The 2 exact, practical steps you can use as early as tonight to break control and access this dimension consciously and intentionally. I want you to pause for a moment. Not externally, the video will keep playing, but internally. I want you to do one thing while you listen to me. Pay attention to what's happening inside you right now, this very moment. Not your thoughts about what we're discussing. Not your opinions or your doubts. But what's beneath all of it? There's something there that observes thoughts without being the thoughts. There's a presence that's here before any idea about Archons, about Gnosticism, about Jesus, or about anything else. Can you feel that? That dimension that simply is, effortlessly, without construction, without needing to prove anything. The masters of all the traditions I mentioned earlier converge on an affirmation that, when you truly understand it, changes everything. What you are seeking is what is seeking. The consciousness that seeks the light itself. The spark that wants to recognize itself as divine house already divine, even before it starts seeking. This isn't a word game. It's the most precise and most difficult point to assimilate on this entire journey, because the mind that has been shaped by archontic mechanisms, the mind of forgetfulness and imitation, automatically translates this into just another objective to be achieved, another spiritual goal to be conquered, and in doing so, it perpetuates the very pattern that needs to be dissolved. Let me tell you about an experience a woman named Bernadette Roberts described in her book, The Experience of No Self, published in the 80s. Roberts was a former Carmelite nun who, after years of contemplative practice, went through what she described as the complete dissolution of the boundary between the self and the all. Not as a temporary ecstatic experience, but as a permanent and irreversible shift in the way she inhabited existence. What she described as remaining after this dissolution wasn't nothing, wasn't emptiness. It was a full, silent presence that she recognized as having always been there, beneath the entire ego structure. What makes Roberts' account especially relevant to what we're discussing is what she said about the process of reaching that point. She described a phase she called the work, in which she began to perceive how her mind constantly created a separate self, how every thought, every emotion, every preference, every fear, was a way of affirming and reaffirming an identity that, deep down, had no substance of its own. And she realized that the only necessary move wasn't to build something new, but to stop believing in the existing construct. In Gnostic language, she was describing the deactivation of the mechanism of forgetfulness, the moment the soul stops believing in the veil and starts seeing through it. But here's the part Roberts emphasized most strongly, and which directly echoes Jesus' teaching in the Gospel of Thomas. This process doesn't require special conditions. It doesn't demand a monastery, doesn't demand years of training, doesn't demand possession of rare texts. It requires only a radical and consistent honesty with one's own experience. The willingness to look directly at what's happening inside you without running away, without embellishing, without explaining, and to ask, is this thing I'm calling me really who I am, or is it a construct I've learned to inhabit? Jesus put this in a way that was recorded even in the canonical Gospels, although the Gnostic context that makes it fully comprehensible has been removed. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 17, verse 21, he says, "The kingdom of God is within you." This single sentence, if taken literally and followed to its ultimate consequences, completely dissolves the need for any spiritual intermediary, any institution, any external authority. What you seek is already where you are. The question is simply whether you're looking in the right direction. And now, the question I want to leave you with, the question I ask you to carry with you and not try to answer with the analytical mind, but to feel. If the kingdom you seek is already within you, what does that change about how you're living your life today? What would be different if you woke up tomorrow absolutely convinced that you carry everything you need within yourself? Hold on to that question, because it's the door, and on the other side of that door are the two steps. We've arrived at the most practical moment of this whole conversation. The moment when the knowledge we've journeyed through together stops being history, philosophy, and comparative spirituality, and becomes a tool you can use as early as tonight, in the quiet of your room, without any special equipment, without any elaborate ritual, without needing anyone but yourself. The first step Jesus described to break archontic control is most completely recorded in the Apocryphon of John. It's called anamnesis, and the text's a Greek word that literally means the removal of forgetfulness, the act of remembering. But it's not a remembrance of past events. It's the remembrance of essential nature, the recognition of the divine spark you carry. So practically, how do you do this tonight? The process begins with what I'll call the conscious pause. You sit in a quiet place, spine erect, and for a period of at least 10 minutes, preferably 20, you do one specific thing. You observe your thoughts without engaging with them. Don't suppress them. Don't analyze them. Simply watch them as if they were clouds passing across the sky. And as you observe, you direct your attention not to the clouds, but to the sky. Not to the thoughts, but to the consciousness that perceives them. At which you find when your attention rests on the observer instead of the observed, that silent, attentive presence, nameless and without history, is what the Gnostics called the spark. It's what Buddhism calls Rigpa. It's what Vedanta calls Atman. It's what Jesus calls the kingdom within you. And the simple act of recognizing it, of resting in it for a few moments, is the first step. It is the act of anamnesis. It is the removal of the veil of forgetfulness. The second step is described more explicitly in the Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text. It's referred to in academic studies as the act of naming, and Jesus describes it in a way that initially seems simple but has profound implications. The principle is this: archontic control operates through identification. When you completely identify with your thoughts, your emotions, your fears, your personal history, you give these constructs the power to command your consciousness. The second step is the act of naming them without merging with them. In practice, it works like this. When you're in the conscious pause and a thought arises, instead of being swept away by it, you simply name it internally: thought. When an emotion arises, you name it: fear, anxiety, desire. When a narrative about your life starts to build, you name it: story. This act of naming creates a separation, a distance between the consciousness that observes and the content that is observed. And in that distance, in that space that opens up, archontic control loses its power. Because control depends on fusion, on complete identification. When there's an observer who isn't identical to the observed, the game changes. Contemporary neuroscience remarkably validates this process. Neuroimaging studies conducted by neuroscientist Judson Brewer from Brown University show that the practice of disidentified observation, which he researches in the context of treating addictions and anxiety, produces measurable changes in the activity of the medial prefrontal cortex, the region associated with self-processing, and the default mode network, which is the brain circuit active when we're stuck in rumination, self-referential thought, and compulsive autobiographical narrative. In simple terms, when you practice the two steps Jesus described, your brain literally changes. The circuits associated with compulsive identity control weaken. The circuits associated with conscious presence strengthen. This isn't magic, it's not blind faith, it's not autosuggestion, it's laboratory verifiable neurophysiology. But the dimension that neuroscience still can't fully capture is the experiential dimension. What happens when you regularly practice these two steps isn't just a measurable improvement in mental health indicators, though that certainly happens too. It's a gradual shift in your fundamental relationship with existence. Objectless fear begins to lose its grip, because you realize that the one who was afraid was a construct, not you. The compulsive seeking, the need for external validation weakens, because you start tapping into the very thing you were chasing outside yourself. And that gut feeling of being trapped, of spinning your wheels going nowhere, it starts to melt away. You realize the whole time, it was your ego doing the circling, not your true awareness. You can kick off this practice tonight. 10 minutes, quiet spot, spine straight, eyes closed. Point your attention to what observes, not what is being observed. When thoughts pop up, just name them silently and bring your focus back to the observer. Do this every night for 7 days and just watch what shifts, not what your mind tells you should change. What actually changes in the texture of your daily grind? That's the experiment Jesus laid out for us, and it's an experiment you can run right now, with everything you've already got, no permission slips needed from anyone. The Archons, they thrive on you forgetting who you are and getting lost in your identity. Anamnesis and conscious naming, those are the 2 steps that unravel that whole mess. And now you know where they are, what they are, and how to work them. Look, we've hit the end of a journey that kicked off with a disquieting question and wraps up with something you can take home and put to use tonight. We've walked through over 2 millennia of history together, dug through texts that survived the bonfire, chatted up spiritual traditions from 4 different continents, and landed on 2 simple steps Jesus specifically laid out for this very moment. Anamnesis, the act of remembering who you truly are, and conscious naming, the act of not blending into the constructs the Archons use to keep consciousness locked down. Anyone who stuck around this long, you're already different from the person who hit play on this video. Most folks bailed out early, but you stuck it out, and that means there's something in you that recognizes the weight of what's been said here. That recognition right there, that's the first ripple of anamnesis. If this video blew your mind, hit that like button right now. That helps the channel big time, keeps us bringing this kind of content to folks who need it. Subscribe here and ring that bell, because the next videos are going to dig even deeper into every layer we explored today, in a way you won't want to miss. And anyone who made it all the way to the end, drop the phrase Awakened Spark in the comments below. That's it, Awakened Spark. I want to see all you warriors who stuck with it, because you deserve the shout out. And check out the video popping up on your screen right now. It's directly linked to what we just covered, and it'll take you even further down this rabbit hole. You seriously don't want to miss it.